No gap. Welcome everyone to the latest event of the Howard Zinn Memorial Lecture Series that is also co-sponsored with Haymarket Books. And we are honored to have Richard Seymour, author of The Liberal Defense of Murder, The Meaning of David Cameron, which I don't have, and American Insurgents, the book we're all here to listen to about today, A Brief History of American Anti-Imperialism. And he's also a prolific socialist writer from the United Kingdom. He runs the blog Lenin's Tomb, which you should all check out as well. And he will be speaking at the 2012 Socialism Conference, which you can find flyers on your chairs as well. And before we start as well, if anyone is willing, we have a donations box in the back to help defray costs for Comrade Seymour coming out to speak with us. So feel free to donate whatever you're capable of. So let's have a round of applause for our speaker. And
thank you very much. You'll have to bear with me while I get in the swing of things. I'll just come here from New York, having arrived there from DC, having previously arrived there from Philly. So I'm a bit all over the place, but I don't know if any of you know who I am and know my shtick usually, but ordinarily I would start a meeting like this by uttering some anti-American remarks. Obviously that's not going to go down well here, because tonight we're obviously here to pay tribute in part to a distinctly American tradition of resistance to imperialism. And I would say, speaking schematically, that this tradition is rooted in, first of all, the American Revolution and the liberal revolutionary tradition, but also, as importantly, the internationalist traditions of socialism, anarchism, and so on. And to the extent that this book is about that aspect of the liberal tradition that I mentioned, it does tie in a little bit with the other book that Doug talked about, The Liberal Defense of Murder, which is, just to explain, it's a history of liberal imperialism. I mean, the idea was essentially, you know, where are all these liberals coming from who are in favor of Bush? Where are all these liberals coming from who are in favor of the war on Iraq? And, you know, looking into the history, going back to Locke, Tocqueville, Mill, the Fabians, the Wilsonians in the United States, you see that there is a long tradition of this, and I traced a genealogy of that sort of ideology up to the present day. And on the face of it, it would look like American Insurgents is something similar. It's a genealogy of ideas, but this time of good ideas, which takes us from the American Revolution up to the present day. But actually, despite these similarities, there is a stark shift in problematic between the two. I mean, as I mentioned, liberal defense is a genealogy of ideas, you know, and obviously there's similarities. But American Insurgents is necessarily, because of the kind of material that it's covering, is sort of an excavation of movements, of coalitions, of parties, slogans, ideologies, strategies, and tactics. In other words, it's got a profound strategic focus. And although I sort of started out trying to write what was in effect sort of a follow-up to liberal defense, it became something quite different. It became a strategic analysis, and that's what the book is, even when I'm not, wasn't really necessarily aware of actually doing that. And I would ask you sort of to bear that in mind when you're reading it. I mean, for those of you who are interested in this kind of thing, it does bear a strong Gramscian freight throughout, and that will be obvious to you as you're reading through it. And I raise this in part because I want you, if you do decide to get the book and read it, to read against the grain of it somewhat, because in a book like this there is a bias towards success, in as much as you are talking, even in a limited sense, of talking about what did actually happen. Whereas historically there is, you know, the problem of what didn't happen, what never took off. I write in the book about the nuclear freeze movement, the anti-nuclear movement from the late 70s and early 80s. I mean, it was a huge movement in the United States history. But what was striking about this was that some of the, you know, in 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon, you could have extraordinary marches against nuclear proliferation and absolutely nothing about Israel. And this was something, this was, if you like, the dog that didn't bark. This is a movement that never took off. And that reflected an historic weakness of the American left at the time. It never really come to terms with what Israel was, what it represented, in terms of its politics and its oppression of the Palestinians. I'm just saying that, I'm not saying this to point out the weaknesses of my own book. I'm really just saying it to point out that, the strategic lessons are probably there in some symptomatic absences as much as in what is palpably there. Now I mentioned, and I said this was schematic, and I've underlined this point again, but there are two major strategic orientations in American anti-imperialism historically. There is what I would characterize as the liberal variety, and of course the socialist variety, and there's no iron wall between these two. But the distinction does exist, it is important, and it is recurrent throughout the history. And I should say also that when I'm talking about anti-imperialism here, when I use that phrase to talk about certain movements, I'm not just talking about those movements that sort of identified themselves as anti-imperialists, who said, we are anti-imperialists, because actually that would be quite a small book, and be quite a narrow book. And also, it might also be a misleading book, because one of the major organizations to actually call itself anti-imperialist, the Anti-Imperialist League, from the turn of the century, was, actually, by contemporary standards, you would think not really anti-imperialist. I mean, it wasn't against all forms of intervention, it certainly wasn't against all forms of expansion. It contained profoundly racist elements, which I'll come back to. So I'm not describing as anti-imperialist those who call themselves anti-imperialist, nor am I describing those as anti-imperialists those who correctly theorized about imperialism, because that would be a tiny book and really sort of only worth the interest of antiquarians. I'm describing anti-imperialists those movements which arose to challenge the specific manifestations of empire as it reproduced and extended itself over time. So, for example, I deal with the movements to stop Indian clearances, because this was a very important sort of imperialist conflict at the time. I deal with the movements to stop the Mexican-American War as the slavocracy expanded. I deal with the Anti-Imperialist League, very importantly. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because I think it's a crucial moment of American history. I deal with the anti-Vietnam War movement, solidarity with Central America, the anti-apartheid and pro-Palestine movements. And what you'll notice about these, of course, is that not all of them have to do with, directly with wars. We tend to think of imperialism mostly in connection with some horrible war that's been launched, but actually many of these were not. Similarly, nor were they necessarily opposed to justifiable violence. In a lot of cases, they were supporting movements that used violence in self-defense, quite rightly. So they were not simply anti-war, and they were not pacifist. And I submit, therefore, that they were united in dealing with the problems posed by empire. But also when, if you're reading the book, when you're going through it, you will begin to notice something, which is that empire itself penetrates everywhere, okay? It penetrates every social relation in a given society, such that being an anti-imperialist at a given moment can tend to mean things like you might have to be a feminist to be a consistent anti-imperialist, or you might have to be anti-racist to be a consistent anti-imperialist, or you might have to be struggling as an oppressed minority or as a class over your interests to be a consistent anti-imperialist. Examples of this will come up in the talk, but the point that I'm making is that imperialism first affects and penetrates all social relations within that social formation that that becomes imperialist. To give you an example, there was recently a case of Occupy Wall Street activists who were set up by the FBI. Essentially, I think they were goaded into planning to blow up some bridge or other, And this wouldn't have happened if the FBI agent hadn't actually been egging them on and trying to get them to do it. So it was incitement. But the fact is that the FBI have been doing this for the last 10 years to Muslims all across the country under the rubric of the War on Terror. This is an imperialist tactic as part of the whole tactic of managing anti-war and anti-imperialist ideology within the US, and it's become a tactic for managing subversion and dissent more generally. And this speaks to something that Aimé Césaire, the great Martinican anti-colonial fighter and poet, said. that this barbarism that European colonial societies inflict on the rest of the world has a tendency slowly to drip back into their own societies, and that barbarism would become known as fascism. And that's something to bear in mind, and it's just to highlight again the way in which imperialism structures social relations domestically. It's not something that's just happening out there, in other words. And obviously I can't give away the plot of the book too much. I want to sell a few copies. And I don't want to summarize it too much in detail. But what I wanted to take a look at for now, if that's okay, is to look at something called the Anti-Imperialist League, which is really one of the most celebrated examples of anti-imperialist organization, or anti-war organization in American history. The Anti-Imperialist League is amazing because it happened at a time when nothing similar had happened in Europe. And I think that's worth pointing out because actually, this is not well known outside the United States. I don't know how well known it is inside the United States. It's it's an obscure fact, but there's a tendency to perceive Americans as being actually quite okay with empire and quite okay with war. And there's a tradition, often a submerged tradition, which gives the lie to this idea. And the Anti-Imperialist League took place it sort of emerged in response to the Spanish-American War and the attempt by the United States effectively to annex the colonial properties of the Spanish Empire, particularly Cuba and the Philippines. And it was something that gained incredible social depth and breadth as it developed. And I want to focus on this league partly to rescue it from what E.P. Thompson, the historian, called the enormous condescension of posterity, but also to rescue it from the stupid libertarians. Sorry if there are any stupid libertarians. Not sorry if you're offended, I'm just sorry if you're a stupid libertarian. But for whom it is, for them, this Anti-Imperialist League is an important moment in developing, creating a right-wing anti-imperialist tradition. And because of that, their attitude is just extremely unseemly and reverential, and they whitewash, if that is indeed the correct word, the segregationist elements, that were very important to the Anti-Imperialist League, which I'll come back to. The exclusion of women, the marginalization of blacks and of the working class left. We'll come back to all that. But if you read any article about the Anti-Imperialist League on antiwar.com or one of these libertarian sort of anti-war websites, you'll find that this sort of attitude is replicated. And we should have a more critical attitude than that, because we can learn things by doing that. I select the League because it's both the most successful anti-imperialist movement of its epoch, but for that very reason, the gravest and most consequential failure. Because it occurs at a moment that is extremely pivotal in US history. It is, if you will, an overdetermined moment. It's one in which the populist movement, which is an extremely important 19th century sort of class uprising. I mean, it is proto-communist in many ways. You've got rural workers in the south, you've got urban workers in the north. It's biracial. I mean, not completely unproblematic as far as its racial politics, but nonetheless there is a tendency towards some sort of unified working class uprising here, or at least uprising of the labouring classes, and it takes on a populist form. But by the late 19th century it's facing defeat. It's going down to defeat, and a sure sign of that is that the Democrats are starting to show an interest. It's actually in the context of its decline that the Democrats start to try and co-opt its ideas, its energies, its themes. At the same time, in response to this populist challenge, Southern plantation owners have started to embark on a new form of politics known as Jim Crow. Now, I should explain part of what I mean by this. The populist movement partly arose as resistance to an attempt to impose capitalist methods of industry on agriculture, and basically to subordinate labour in the sort of southern rural areas. And because the populist movement was a form of resistance to that, the southern sort of ruling class, the southern plantation owners, wanted to come up with a political apparatus to control labour. Since they didn't have the means technologically to subsume and control the labour process, Jim Crow was a very important way of doing it, regulating the ways in which labour could move around. Never mind just disempowering black voters electorally and preventing them from having any political voice, but actually regulating their movements, regulating their behaviour, regulating what employers they could go to, on what terms they could negotiate and bargain, and so on and so forth. This was an extremely important move for them in controlling the labour process. And so that was also an extremely important moment. But also, American capitalism was just starting to reach some of its internal limits. I mean, it had gone through an extremely rapid period of expansion, then it experienced a series of crises, and suddenly, the closing the frontier means that the territorial solution is closed off. And it's not obvious how you can go about that, except maybe through some form of colonial solution, which is taking off in Europe. It's all the fashion in Europe at that time. And then there was a particular politics of immigration taking off, predictably. There's a nativist reaction, a sort of war against Chinese immigrants, particularly. And of course, there are simultaneously the very beginnings of a socialist current within the working class, which is hugely important, particularly for what I'm about to tell you. I would like to, obviously, go into a lot more detail on this, but I'll save it for the Q&A if that's all right. It's striking that at this moment the US looks to solve its problems by annexing some Spanish territories. Why does it do that? Well, they've been looking at these vast potential markets in China. China is a huge market for the US, still is. And how are we going to get in there if these European colonial empires are sort of controlling everything? Well, knocking Spain out of the Philippines is a fairly good way of doing it. So getting control of the Philippines was a hugely important thing for the American ruling class at this point, or at least for sections of it. And it's striking that when that happened, there were those who initially were strongly and profoundly supportive of it. People like, for example, Mark Twain, who would go on to become an extremely important anti-imperialist, at first said that I thought we should act as their protector. He thought that the American military would go in, liberate these people, and give them a chance to set up something like the American Bill of Rights, Constitution, all of that, and then leave. Samuel Gompers, I know his name isn't exactly hallowed in American labour history, but we have to talk about him. He's another Brit who came over to tell you what to do. He was, at that time, sort of someone who was actually strongly supportive of the war, and he said that the US was performing a necessary service as a champion of freedom and as the protector of a weak and struggling people. I mean, he would go on, along with Mark Twain, to use the same ideas to turn those against empire, which I think is very important for us to recognise. We should never underestimate this tradition, this liberal revolutionary tradition. No matter that the ideas are all too often pressed into the service of malign purposes, there's an ambiguity there at the heart which we should be aware of, and that has something to say about what kind of coalitions can be built, but I'll come back to that. So they very quickly turned against empire on the basis of the very same liberal ideas and values that they had used to support empire. And in alliance with them, and this is also very important, were those who, still operating within the broad ambit of liberalism, had really never been persuaded by war and empire, because there is something in liberalism that is actually profoundly ambivalent about nationalism and patriotism. I mean, I know that liberal nationalism has got a strong current in this country. We get all your Steven Spielberg movies, thank you very much for those, all the Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan and all the rest of it. There is also a tradition of anti-patriotism in sort of American liberalism. People like Henry James and Jane Addams, who was a very prominent radical feminist at the time, both of them found these displays of patriotism absolutely nauseating. So, the League is launched, it includes these sort of liberal intellectuals. It includes sections of Labour led by Sam Gompers, not always on the most progressive grounds, it has to be said, but nonetheless, Labour is involved. It includes Republicans, Northern Republicans. It includes mugwumps, these so-called unaligned radicals, sort of independents. Mark Twain was something of a mugwump in that sense. But also, very importantly, and very interestingly, includes people like the monopolist Andrew Carnegie, the railroad capitalist Charles Francis Adams. And then, of course, it includes those elements that I mentioned, Southern segregationists. So you have an extremely broad coalition here. I'm not saying that in a sense that usually we talk about a broad coalition as a good thing. This is actually quite problematic. It's broad in a way that will lead to serious defeats for the coalition, but it's not just a broad political and ideological coalition, but it's a very broad class coalition. It includes elements of workers, sort of middle class, petty bourgeois elements, and it includes sections of the ruling class. But even so, as such a broad coalition, it's striking that it was dominated and led overwhelmingly by white bourgeois males. Now, there's, not all white bourgeois males have nothing to be said for them, but this was problematic in these circumstances. And so, I mean, it's a politics were accordingly dominated by a sort of classical liberalism combined with what you might call a Jeffersonian republicanism. And by and large, to be fair to the European anti-imperialists, they had started to develop an analysis, even if they weren't organized in the way that the Americans were, they had started to develop an analysis of imperialism, what is today sometimes misleadingly called an economic analysis of imperialism. Rather, what you would say is a systemic analysis of imperialism, I think, is more to the point, which the Anti-Imperialist League really didn't have. They thought of the imperialism as a policy being pursued by some reckless and malign forces within US politics. And in a sense, they had a point. It was to some extent a policy. I mean, if you've got divisions within not just the population, but among the rich themselves, if you've got sections of the ruling class dissenting on this, to some extent it's a policy choice. There are different options that you can undertake. And of course, it was at that moment when you could choose whether to become a colonial power or not. So to that extent, it was a policy. The problem is it wasn't just a policy. It was also part of a deep-rooted structure in American social life, and in its it built into American nationhood and its forms of expansion, at first over land and increasingly then overseas. So there was that weakness, and that was built into, I would say, its liberal politics. But with that said, and knowing all of the League's flaws, which there is more to say on that, and I will come back to it, one is struck nonetheless by just how consistent some of their analyses were, and also how powerful. I mean, the language did seem mired in this sort of 18th century talk about foreign entanglements. This is the sort of Jeffersonian rhetoric, the fetishism about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I'm sure you still have that around today, actually. But actually, there was a tactical reason for this. Not just it wasn't just to do with their ideology, because when you've got a coalition that broad, the only baseline that could possibly unite them in an American context is precisely this kind of American liberalism, the sort of baseline of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence. And they did put this language to good effect. To be fair, I mean, they could defend the right of Filipinos to self-government by citing the Declaration of Independence. They could, despite the inclusion of segregationists, the vast majority of the propaganda of the League and their speeches and whatnot were strongly anti-racist. In a way, that is striking for its time, and given the sort of white supremacist reflux. And yes, I mean, the Dixiecrats themselves, I mean, they were driven mainly by the fear that the empire would boost the sectional power of the North, and also, of course, that it would lead to the incorporation of brown-skinned subjects into the nation, which they thought was, this would weaken our Anglo-Saxon democracy. This is a long tradition in the South, actually. When during the period of massive resistance to desegregation, when Hawaii's status came up and there was the question of the US annexing it as a state, the South mobilized the strongest resistance to this, not on the basis that they were anti-imperialist, but just because they didn't think that the country could take any more black people. I mean, that was their logic, and we have to take that seriously. It wasn't just just something they used to rationalize what they were doing. They really deeply, profoundly believed in this, and that's a problem when you're looking at the Anti-Imperialist League. Still, even having said that, the thrust of the League's propaganda and appeal was not that. Indeed, it was absolutely contrary to that logic and argument. Moreover, the League was actually uniquely important in drawing attention to the atrocities of US troops at a time when they were increasingly isolated in a sort of refulgent nationalism with a certain kind of canonization of the troops. The goddamn troops. You can't say anything about the troops. They knew all about that then. So I would say it's not the ideology of the League that was most inhibitive to them, but actually its politics. That is, its liberal, constitutional, parliamentarist politics. And really it's in this sense that you start to see the sort of workers, women, African Americans being exploited by the League in a sense, because their labour is used in terms of building up the League's appeal among sort of American constituencies, in terms of organising, in terms of spreading the League's propaganda, but they aren't allowed any say in the running of the show. That is straightforward exploitation in a sense. The shots were very much called by those bourgeois white men that I mentioned. And of course, while segregationists were fated and included in the coalition, the growing socialist left really wasn't. It wasn't actually entirely the League's fault that the socialist left wasn't involved. We are talking about socialists here. There were a few sectarians among them. There were some who just thought that this wasn't such a big deal, the colonial turn. This is something cooked up by the ruling class to talk among themselves. We're not going to get involved. There were others who were involved in the anti-war movement, but who kind of preferred to do things by themselves and not get involved. So, and also, to be fair to the socialists, actually, the League, a League that includes capitalists and, southern segregationists could be profoundly unappealing to, left-wing internationalists. You can understand that. But nonetheless, they weren't included. And so that says something about the nature of the coalition that they were after.
They were or they were not?
They were not. So the socialist left was profoundly excluded. There were Labour, to some extent included, especially with Sam Gompers involved, but actually often on a nativist basis. In other words, if we go and conquer the Philippines, we might have to incorporate Filipino labour. That was part of the argument. So there were reactionary elements to this even there. Nonetheless, what you see here is a very big, broad coalition which gets so much support that the Democrats start to show an interest. And actually, it was part of their usurpation of the populist dynamic, which I mentioned earlier, that led to them running what they called an anti-imperialist candidate in 1900, William Jennings Bryan. They'd run him before, but this time he was an anti-imperialist. And the League could have retained their political independence. They had this choice, whether to support Bryan for the presidency or not. And indeed, there was some disquiet over elements of Bryan's campaign. There was the question of free silver. He was floating this idea of free silver to help indebted farmers. And the problem with this, of course, was, apart from the sort of northern and eastern working class, whose wages would be reduced in value by this inflationary policy, it wasn't very handy for those northern commercial and capitalist interests that the Republican elements were trying to get on side. So they wrote to William Jennings Bryan, begging him to drop this policy. We'll support almost anything else if you just drop this one policy. No dice, he wouldn't do it. Problem is that he wasn't even a very good anti-imperialist. After all, he had helped inflict one of the major defeats on the Anti-Imperialist League. One of their biggest campaigns, the earliest campaigns, had been to try and stop the Treaty of Paris. What was the Treaty of Paris? Well, this was the treaty that they signed with Spain to organize the cession of Spanish territories in the Philippines and Cuba to the United States for the bargain price of $20 million. There was one of the major cruxes of the Anti-Imperialist League's campaign was to try and get that voted down in the Houses of Congress. And Bryan had voted against them. So, and not only that, but later on, when he was Wilson's Secretary of State, and he actually had some influence over these things, he was very important in supporting US intervention into the Mexican Revolution. I talk about this in my book, and I think it's, I can't go into any detail now, but just to say, if any of you are wondering, of course, it wouldn't be the first or last time that the US would intervene on the side in someone else's revolution, posing as a revolutionary power. And something you might want to bear in mind when questions like Libya or even Syria come up. But nonetheless, support for the Democrats was a loser either way. If Bryan lost, as he did, the investment in the election campaign by the League would result in the dissipation of the energy and momentum of the anti-imperialist campaign, as it did. Equally, if the Democrats won, this would be a reason for large parts of the active base to say, job done. And in all likelihood, actual policy wouldn't really change very much because, what we know about Bryan. But nonetheless, people would declare victory. And the ability of the Anti-Imperialist League to achieve critical mass in the streets or in meeting halls or whatever would have been lost. So they lost a lot from that campaign. They lost members, they lost initiative, they lost a degree of their political independence. Soon they were trying to keep a light on atrocities by US soldiers, as I mentioned, amid a refulgent US nationalism. And of course, I mentioned the problem with the sort of pro-troops ideology. It's also worth saying that even at this time, not all troops behaved the same. I mean, apart from the many, many troops who defected or just deserted, there weren't many who defected. There was one very famous one who defected, a guy called David Fagan, who actually, never mind, running home and not fighting anymore, decided he was going to fight for the other side. And he became quite famous because he became actually one of their better fighters. There's a kind of humanitarian intervention that I will get behind. If this had happened a lot more, really, I mean, I'm quite serious about this. If this had happened more, the Philippines would not even today be an offshore subsidiary of US capitalism. They would not have suffered decades of being suppressed under various pro-US dictatorships. They wouldn't have suffered the murder of the Hux Rebellion, and they would not have suffered something like the 200,000 deaths that they did as a consequence of the actual war that was inflicted on them at the time. So it would have been, in a phrase, repeat, a humanitarian intervention. And the League, to be fair, didn't simply give up when they found that their forces were severely diminished. And they did make efforts to support the cause of the insurgents, which I think was very important. And actually in later wars, such as during the Wilson's invasion of Haiti, they actually made explicit alliance with the rebels. They brought rebels, actually members of the insurgent army, over to give talks. They printed appeals on behalf of the rebels. By then, actually, to be fair, it was a much smaller organization. It was a more radical organization, but that was largely because the segregationists had drifted away. They'd been reassured. They don't have to worry about empire anymore because the northern sort of establishment said to them, we're prepared to make peace. If you want to establish white supremacy in the south, we'll establish it overseas. That's fine. That was the deal. So, it had become a smaller organization, it had become more radical, it had lost many of its business supporters, it had lost the segregationists. So, it had become quite a different kind of organization, and after that, of course, it became kind of, overtaken by other kinds of organization, very importantly, in later years, the Communist Party USA. I won't go into detail about that. But I do want to sort of point out some of the strategic lessons that seem to stick out to me from this. First of all, I mentioned it was an exceptionally broad coalition, but there was no real inclusion of the black and feminist groups who were actually also organising against the war, but often organising outside the League. And they fated the segregationists instead. So, when people talk about building broad coalitions, yeah, I'm all for that, but think about what kind of coalition you're building. Think about the limitations that it can impose. I hear talk about a left-right coalition against imperialism in the United States. We've got to get Ron Paul on board and all his sort of nerdish supporters. Fine, if that's what you want to do, but just bear in mind the limitations that this can impose on you politically and in terms of the tactics, the tactical repertoire that you might be able to deploy. That's all I'm saying. Second of all, they invested all in parliamentary action, trying to stop the Treaty of Paris, as I mentioned. Actually, I didn't mention the segregationists let them down there because about 10 southern states actually voted in favour of it, enabling the Treaty of Paris to go through. So even on that score, the coalition was a complete failure. And they failed. So, and then gambling on Bryan's presidency and failing. And they would have failed had he won or had he lost. So, what distinguishes that from the sort of campaigns of the future, which would enjoy a great deal more success, obviously all sort of caveats borne in mind, such as the anti-Vietnam War movement or the solidarity movements with Central America, is that the latter were disruptive. They exercised this disruptive power, that it wasn't just a question of hitting the streets and blocking roads and things like that. You know, we saw this with the civil rights movement being transposed into the anti-Vietnam War movement. But actually, very importantly, you know, a crucial moment in the history of the anti-Vietnam War movement was the moratorium, which signified the entrance of organised labour into the anti-war movement in a serious way, given that the labour bureaucracy had basically been, you know, an amanuensis for empire, you know, throughout the Cold War period. This was a major development. But the point was that, you know, if you can't keep order, and you're not sure that workers are coming to work tomorrow and that you'll be able to turn a profit, then the whole system starts to feel a bit of a strain. And that's when you start to see some results. And that is, in fact, when you start to see American businesses line up to tell Johnson and then Nixon, you've got to stop this thing. So I would say, think about other forms of action other than parliamentary action. That's all I'm saying. Thirdly, they access some of the best resources of revolutionary liberalism, but partly because there was no implicit critique of US society and what they were saying. You know, as I say, imperialism was to them a policy mainly. They found it hard to link the war to domestic interests. In other words, if you can think about the ways in which empire is actually not just a policy but structurally rooted in American society, in ways in which it affects people's day-to-day lives, you've got more of a chance of mobilizing people against that policies, the policies that come out of imperialism. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, you know, very shortly after the League's sort of zenith and decline, the Socialist Party became a major force for anti-imperialist action in the United States, not just in solidarity with the Mexican Revolution, as ambiguous and problematic as that solidarity could sometimes be, but actually when trying to stop Wilson from leading America into World War I. And what did they do? They went around to the workers. They said to them, this war is not in your interest, it's in the interests of capitalists, and if they fight this war, you will have shortages and you will starve, and if you don't starve, you'll be sent to the front line and you'll be killed. It's not in your interest to fight this war. Fight the capitalists instead. Go on strike. And they did. They won a lot of people, workers over to that policy and that idea. Many, many workers went on strike. It wasn't just over the war. Usually it was linked to something that they were fighting over anyway. But that was actually an important strategy on their part. And the success of the socialists in doing this was one of the reasons why Wilson launched the first real serious sort of, if you like, proto-McCarthyite movement in the United States. The first real anti-communist crackdown. Involving sort of you know, the Bureau of Investigation and the sort of committees of inquiry and the militias on the ground and the sort of crack mobs that were sent in to smash people up and smash up left-wing organisation. So really, you know, the real question is, you know, not just whether or not you can criticise the war in elegant enough terms, but whether you can do so in a way that speaks to people's day-to-day lives and interests. And that's why I mentioned, you know, that you have to see the way in which empire is linked to social relations all, you know, throughout the whole society. And in the end, the League were really surpassed by the developing socialist challenge, which I referred to, and which did very soon have to take the question of imperialism a lot more seriously than some of them had done. And that kind of radical bourgeois liberalism was eclipsed to an extent, and it resulted in the availability of new kinds of coalitions and new kinds of strategies. But of course, I don't want to give the impression to anybody that I'm dismissive at all of this tradition, because obviously liberals haven't gone away, and liberalism remains a powerful sort of, if you like, hegemonic language within the US. It's something, everybody knows how to talk in the language of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, you know. And it's not something, you know, if you're really rooted in your social formation, you should be able to speak that language too, I think. And that's something that you should be aware of the power of it, even if you want to have an ambivalent relationship to it. So all I'm saying is don't underestimate revolutionary liberalism, even if it's well past its revolutionary phase. The rest, of course, is a book, insanely good value, which I will sign copies at the end if you want, if you're into that sort of thing. But also, it's also an archive of strategic clues, prompts, and errors, which we will all benefit from excavating. Thank you very much. just going to take questions.
Sure.
Are you going to take?
Yeah, I'll take questions.
I mean, I could do it as well.
You can take questions if you want as
all
well,
right.
but Ian?
Thank you for that. Just maybe carrying on from your closing comments, could you say a little bit more about what you mean by liberalism?
Sure.
Along those lines, there's at least a very interesting dialogue in the modern left about the exact relationship between capitalism and imperialism, which you were dancing around. And in addition to clarifying liberalism, I would appreciate if you could clarify those three categories and their interrelation in your mind.
Thanks. First of all, I wonder if how familiar you may be with the work of someone who used to live in the Boston area named Boone Sherman, who wrote a book called Republic or Empire, largely about the anti-imperialist movement. His entire family were, and some of them still living, have been activists in a variety of ways. I could tell you more later, but and then I'm interested in what you attribute to organized labor in the anti-Vietnam War movement. The moratorium you mentioned, I believe that was in October of 1969.
Yeah.
I think it would be great if workers and organized workers in the form of labor unions would have participated more energetically in the anti-war movement, but I wonder really how important that was. I mean, it can be sort of ideologically convenient to attribute, that change to the power of, all of a sudden. But living through that period, I remember after that, construction workers attacking
the
anti-war
hard hats,
people in New York, where I was active in the anti-war movement. And then the last question is, you use this phrase in different ways of how to understand how it's integrated into the daily. Imperialism is systemically organized into the daily lives of people, and I'd be interested to hear you elaborate on that a little, please.
Alex?
How many are you?
Who's ever has hands up, essentially.
This actually follows a bit on that last question, which is one of the things you were saying about the Anti-Imperialist League is some of the problems with liberal anti-imperialism, some of the other kind of anti-imperialism there was that it lacked this kind of systemic analysis, which has been a distinctive feature of left-wing anti-imperialism, the ability to show how imperialism isn't just the use of force somewhere, but it emerges out of a historical period in the development of capitalism or in the development of social relations. And the suggestion was we should all learn from this, and that our analysis on our anti-imperialism should also carry with it this kind of analysis of how imperialism works today and how it's bound up with social relations. But it seems to me, I'm not quite sure. I would like to see you. I would like you to offer a bit what you think the distinctive character is of imperialism today, because it seems like it's quite different actually from the 19th and early 20th century. At least. I mean, it's not clear that the use of force by the American military is in any way, directly, really bound up with material interests in the way that it really was. Very clearly, funding markets, raw materials, resources of exploited labor. It's just not obvious at all. Haiti, Kosovo, a lot of these places, it's just not obvious. Maybe it's connected to some other political interests, but I think it'd be just as easy to say that the Iraq War was a Gramscian political error by the ruling class, as much as it was something that really served long-run national interests. So if you could just say more about these things.
One more, and Kwame.
Capitalism had to expand in order to become a power, so it started in a couple of places a few hundred years ago, but it had to expand. So the nature of it did not become a power just staying in one or two countries. And then I remember, I wasn't alive then, but 1884 to 1885, there was the Berlin Conference, and the United States sent 2 representatives there, so they were trying to see, visualize overseas eventually. There was a senator whose name I can't recall. I think it might have been Citizen Pettigrew. He was a Republican senator in the early part of the 20th century. He was in the Senate for about 17 years, and he was denouncing U.S. imperialism. overseas.
I think we have enough for you to respond.
For the first round.
Yes, very weak.
All right. First of all, just to respond to you quickly, I don't know the book that you mentioned, but I'd be very interested in it. Reorganized labour. I know exactly what you're talking about the hard hats. I think I agree with you. This was extremely important. This is not something that can be overlooked. On the other hand, I think it was important that organised labour and the relationship with the sort of student left, the new left, the sort of civil rights movement was to some extent repaired during that period. I mean, there was a serious breach. I mean, if you look at anti-war activists storming sort of AFL-CIO conference in, I think it was 1965, saying, basically down with labour frauds, down with labour fakes. And the head, who was I think George Meany, saying, get these nutballs out of here. That sort of relationship was profound. I mean, it basically meant that they were isolated from sort of the mainstream of the working class at that time. Now, I understand what you're saying. I mean, is it just is this something that Marxists want to look back on, from a certain perspective, because maybe the labour movement wasn't that important at the time? I mean, obviously, it's impossible to evaluate, how much the ruling class took on board organised labour. But I think, just as a general point, that first of all, the question of sort of disruptive radicalism was far more important to them than teachings and things like that. So that's the first point I would make. But second of all, when you think about disruption and what that means, what's it for? I mean, what are you trying to do with disruption? You're trying to basically withdraw the cooperation that makes the system work. Your participation in the system, ultimately it depends on you. Now, usually that isn't acknowledged. Your contribution to making everything happen as it should, or happen as it would, with the system in its normal condition, is not usually acknowledged, and therefore your bargaining power isn't really acknowledged. And disruption is basically an exercise of your bargaining power. It says you have to give us something, otherwise we're going to tear shit up. That's the scholarly phrase for it. But with organised labour, the reason why I put central focus on it, I'm not trying to be revisionist about it, but I think it's important, is because when organised labour does sort of come out on strike, the ability to disrupt directly the ability to make profit and to keep profits flowing into the banks and into corporations and so on, I think is strategically very important, and it's a focus that we should have. So, I mean, maybe you're right about your general point, but I would still underline the strategic point that I was making. On the question about liberalism, which I think is probably the most testing one, because there is no single thing that liberalism is. I mean, this is part of the problem. Liberalism doesn't cohere, but I would say that at base, you can usually find this in liberalism, which is the idea that rule is, in some sense, guaranteed by consent. If it's not explicit consent through democratic government, it's through some form of social contract, or through some sort of implicit acquiescence to a sort of, a Leviathan ruler. That's why liberalism can include figures as different as Hobbes. I don't think most people think of Hobbes as a conservative thing, but I would say he was actually really one of the first liberals. And John Stuart Mill, as different as Locke and Woodrow Wilson. So I mean, it's a very capacious sort of discourse and doctrine and ideology. And that's kind of why it's ambiguous and ambivalent. I mean, it has a revolutionary legacy. I mean, actually, when I was writing the book, The Liberal Defence of Murder, this came up, because I was trying to investigate the basis for liberals supporting war, and, well, there happens to be quite a few different ones. I mean, if you go back to Locke, it's property rights, It's the idea that we, have a right to own people who we haven't killed in war, because we could have killed them, and therefore by right of conquest we have the right to take possession of them as slaves. That's the first thing. Second of all, we have a duty mandated by God, because God wants all that land to be used properly and well and effectively, to take it over from the Indians who are lazy and don't invest in it properly, that don't know how to turn a good rate of return, and to employ capitalist agriculture on the land. That is the Lockean justification. It's quite different from John Stuart Mill, but it's all the more interesting for that reason, because John Stuart Mill was somebody who believed in extending the franchise. He didn't always believe in extending it to the working class, but I think at one point he did. He did believe in extending liberties to women and freeing them from sexist oppression. And in general, he favoured, the greatest the greatest liberty that was possible within a sort of capitalist democracy, except for India. I mean, he was chief examiner of correspondence for the East India Company, and he wrote the company's major apologia for its behaviour when the Great Indian Uprising occurred in 1857. He justified it actually, very interestingly, on the grounds that the company had, brought about good humanitarian benefits for the people, uplifted the people, instituted civilization, schools, helped to free women from oppression. This idea that the East India Company had gone in there and stopped the practice of sati, which was the practice of throwing widows on the pyres, the funeral pyres of their husbands. Actually, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but those who are will tell you, generally speaking, that the end of sati, or at least the abridgment of this practice, was the achievement of indigenous social forces who basically compelled some sort of action against it, rather than of the East India Company itself. But actually, that's sort of what you might call imperial feminism. In other words, the appropriation of feminism by empires got a long history, and it's something we recently saw with Amnesty International. NATO, keep up the progress. So there are these different traditions of liberalism, and John Stuart. But actually, with that tradition, that second tradition, the humanitarian uplift tradition, necessarily comes a certain amount of chauvinism or racism. Necessarily. Because, and John Stuart Mill was explicit about this. He believed that the colonized peoples of the world were in their, what he called their non-age. In other words, they were children. And as long as they remained such, they were fit for despotism. It was appropriate. But that was necessarily the case, because you cannot, if you believe in democracy and civil liberties and freedom in your own social formation, you cannot then deny that to people in India or elsewhere, unless you believe they're somehow backwards or somehow lesser people. So there are these distinct, I might almost say, moments in the development of liberalism. And actually, I would